The hotel lobby was calm, too calm. Soft piano music echoed off polished marble floors. Guests moved in slow, relaxed patterns, rolling suitcases, checking phones, laughing quietly. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed wrong. Keanu Reeves stood near a decorative column, blending in effortlessly. No bodyguards, no attention. No one recognized him. He wore a plain jacket, faded jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. To everyone else, he was just another guest waiting for someone or something. Keanu wasn't rushing. He wasn't nervous. He was simply observing. That's when he noticed the voices. Not loud, not aggressive, just low enough to be ignored by everyone else. At first, he didn't pay attention. Hotels are full of conversations, business deals, complaints, small talk. Most of them fade into background noise, but this one didn't. Something about the tone made him look up. Two people stood a few feet away, partially hidden near the concierge desk. Their voices were controlled, careful. The kind of voices people use when they think they're being discreet. Keanu caught a few words. Then a pause. Then a sentence that didn't belong in a place like this. His body reacted before his mind did. He stopped moving. His shoulders stiffened slightly, and his jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. The look on his face changed so subtly that no one around him noticed. But inside, everything shifted. He listened again. The voices continued calm and deliberate, as if what they were discussing was normal. As if it was something that happened every day. Keanu's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in focus. He wasn't shocked because of who was speaking. He was shocked because of what was being said. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't complaining. It was intent. The kind of intent that makes you realize something wrong is happening right in front of you quietly, politely, hidden in plain sight. Around him, the lobby stayed the same. People laughed, a bellhop rolled a cart past him, someone checked in at the front desk. No alarms, no raised voices. And yet, Keanu stood completely still. Because in that moment, he understood something most people never do until it's too late. If he walked away now, no one would ever know what he had just overheard, and whatever was about to happen would happen anyway. The hotel lobby didn't change after Keanu froze. That was the strangest part. Everything kept moving exactly as it should. A couple near the entrance argued quietly about dinner plans. A businessman laughed into his phone, pacing near the windows. A family checked in, the kids spinning excitedly around their luggage while the receptionist smiled politely. Nothing looked wrong, and that's why it was so easy for everyone else to miss what Keanu couldn't ignore. He shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself closer to the concierge desk without drawing attention. His reflection passed across a polished surface, still just a man in plain clothes, still invisible. That was intentional. Keanu had learned long ago that attention changes everything. When people know who you are, they stop being real. They perform, they hide. But when they think you're no one, they reveal more than they mean to. Right now, no one was performing. The conversation continued behind him, steady and controlled. No panic, no raised voices. Just confidence, the dangerous kind. The kind that comes from believing you won't be challenged. Keanu didn't turn around. He listened without looking, like someone waiting for an elevator. The words came in fragments. Not enough to form a full picture, but enough to feel the shape of it. Plans discussed casually, consequences brushed aside. A tone that suggested power, not strength but leverage. Whoever was speaking believed they were untouchable. Keanu's expression stayed neutral, but his mind was working fast. This place, this hotel, was designed to make people feel safe. Soft lighting, warm colors, friendly staff trained to smooth over discomfort. Problems were meant to be handled quietly, discreetly, behind closed doors. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. Because places like this teach people a subtle lesson. If something looks calm, it must be harmless. Keanu knew better. He'd seen it in different forms throughout his life. Situations that felt controlled until suddenly they weren't. Moments where silence did more damage than noise ever could. He glanced toward the front desk. The staff were busy, efficient, focused on procedures and smiles. They didn't hear the conversation. Or maybe they did, and dismissed it as none of their business. Not out of cruelty. Out of habit. That's how most things slip through unnoticed. The voices paused again. Keanu felt his chest tighten, not from fear, but from clarity. He wasn't overhearing something after it happened. He wasn't hearing a story about a mistake. He was hearing something before it unfolded. Around him, the lobby smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood. The piano music shifted to a slower melody. A bell chimed softly as the elevator doors opened. Normal, predictable, comfortable. Keanu stayed exactly where he was. He didn't reach for his phone, he didn't alert anyone. Not yet, because jumping too early can make things worse. Sometimes, stepping in the wrong way gives the wrong people time to adapt, to cover their tracks, to disappear. Sometimes the smartest move is to understand the full shape of what you're dealing with. So he listened. He noticed how one voice led the conversation, while the other followed. How pauses were used strategically. How certain words were chosen carefully like they'd been rehearsed. This wasn't random. This was practiced. Keanu's eyes drifted across the room again, scanning faces, not searching for suspects, but for impact. Who else could be affected? Who might be nearby without realizing they were part of the equation? That's when he noticed something small, almost invisible. A slight shift in posture from someone standing closer to the conversation. A nervous adjustment. A subtle hesitation. Not everyone was as calm as they pretended to be, and that mattered. Because situations like this don't exist in isolation. There's always someone caught in the middle. Someone who hears too much. Someone who knows enough to be afraid, but not enough to act. Keanu exhaled slowly. This wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about stepping in dramatically or proving anything. It was about timing and responsibility. He understood something most people don't want to admit. Evil rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, wrapped in normalcy. And the people who stop it are usually the ones who notice early, before anyone else believes there's a problem. Have you ever been in a place that felt completely safe, but something about it didn't sit right with you? Keanu didn't know yet what he was going to do, but he knew one thing with certainty. Walking away now would be the easiest option, and the most dangerous one. Keanu focused on the voices again. Now that he was listening properly, he realized something unsettling. They weren't whispering because they were scared. They were whispering because they were confident. Confident enough to believe that even if someone overheard a word or two, it wouldn't matter. Confident enough to speak casually in a public place, surrounded by strangers, as if privacy was guaranteed. That kind of confidence doesn't come from luck. It comes from experience. The conversation resumed, steady and measured. One voice did most of the talking, calm, assured, almost bored. The other responded occasionally, quieter, more cautious, like someone double, checking details they already understood. Keanu caught another fragment. Not names, not dates. Just intention. A reference to timing. A mention of keeping things quiet. A dismissive remark about someone who wouldn't cause trouble. His stomach tightened. It wasn't what they said that disturbed him most. It was how easily they said it. No hesitation. No moral weight. Just logistics. That's when Keanu realized something important. Whatever they were planning wasn't new. This wasn't a bad idea formed in the heat of the moment. This was routine. Familiar. Something they'd done before, or watched others do, without consequence. He adjusted his stance slightly, angling his body so he could hear better without turning around. His face remained neutral, relaxed. To anyone watching, he still looked like a man waiting on someone who was running late. Inside, he was fully alert. The voices paused again. A third sound entered the space, a soft movement nearby. Someone shifting uncomfortably. Someone who was closer to the conversation than they should have been. Keanu noticed it instantly. He didn't look directly, but he sensed it the way you sense tension in a room before an argument breaks out. A presence that didn't belong to the calm rhythm of the lobby. The conversation resumed, but this time there was a difference. One of the speakers lowered their voice further. Not out of fear, but out of control. Like someone deciding how much to reveal and how much to hold back. That told Keanu everything. There was someone nearby who mattered. He listened closely. A phrase slipped through, one that carried weight. Not explicit, not illegal, but loaded with implication. The kind of phrase that only sounds harmless if you want it to. Keanu's jaw tightened. He wasn't imagining this. This wasn't paranoia or overthinking. He'd spent enough years around people, around situations that looked fine on the surface, to recognize the signs. Power, secrecy, disregard. The combination was never accidental. His thoughts moved quickly now, not emotionally, but practically. Who was at risk? How immediate was the situation? What would happen if no one intervened? Around him, life continued without interruption. The receptionist laughed politely at something a guest said. A suitcase tipped over, spilling clothes that someone hurried to gather. A couple walked past, arm in arm, unaware that anything unusual was happening just a few steps away. That contrast hit Keanu harder than the conversation itself. This was how things slipped through cracks, not with chaos, but with normalcy. He caught another sentence. This one was shorter, sharper. It carried certainty. Keanu felt a cold clarity settle in. This wasn't something that might happen someday. This was something already in motion. A decision had been made. Roles assigned, outcomes expected. And whoever was being talked about, whoever was being dismissed so casually, was not in control of what was coming next. Keanu exhaled slowly through his nose. He thought about all the times people later said, "I had a bad feeling, but I ignored it." All the times silence was mistaken for neutrality. This was one of those moments. He didn't need to hear everything to understand enough. That's the lie people tell themselves, that without full information you can't act. That uncertainty excuses inaction. Keanu knew better. You don't need every detail to recognize a line being crossed. He shifted again just slightly, enough to change his proximity to the voices, not close enough to be obvious. Close enough to make one of the speakers hesitate. It worked. There was a brief pause, barely noticeable. But it was there. One voice stopped mid-sentence. The other cleared their throat. They continued, but more carefully now. Keanu didn't smile, he didn't react. But he noted it. They were aware of their surroundings after all. Which meant something else too. If confronted the wrong way, they'd retreat. Adjust Denny. Turn the situation into something harmless sounding. That's how people like this survived. Keanu knew that whatever he chose to do next would matter. Act too early, and the truth would vanish. Wait too long, and the damage would be done. This was the space between, where most people freeze, unsure which mistake is worse. Keanu stood still, listening to the final fragments of the conversation as it began to wind down. A conclusion was reached. A subtle agreement. A sense of closure that felt disturbingly calm. The voices moved away. The lobby didn't react. No one gasped. No one questioned anything. But Keanu remained where he was, eyes fixed ahead, heart steady but heavy. Because now he knew something he couldn't unknow. And in moments like this, there are only two kinds of people. Those who convince themselves it's not their problem, and those who understand that hearing something like this comes with responsibility. Keanu had already made his choice. He just hadn't moved yet. Keanu didn't move. The voices had faded into the general noise of the lobby, blending back into laughter, footsteps, and the soft rhythm of the piano. To everyone else, the moment was already over. For him, it had just begun. His body remained still, but his thoughts were anything but. They came fast now, not panicked, not emotional, but heavy. The kind of thoughts that settle in your chest and refuse to leave. He replayed the fragments he'd overheard, not searching for new meaning, but confirming what he already knew. This wasn't misunderstanding. This wasn't paranoia. This was one of those moments life doesn't announce. No warning, no sign. Just a quiet test of who you choose to be when no one is watching. Keanu felt the familiar instinct rise, the one most people listen to without thinking. Stay out of it. It was logical, safe, comfortable. He was a guest in a hotel. He didn't have full context. He didn't know everyone involved. Stepping in could create confusion, or worse, put the wrong person at risk. That voice was calm, reasonable, and completely wrong. He had learned something over the years, through experience, not theory. The moments that matter most rarely feel dramatic. They feel inconvenient, unclear, easy to ignore. Keanu shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself. He noticed his breathing, slow and steady, the hum of the air conditioning, the faint clink of glasses from the bar, life continuing, and that was the problem. He looked around again, more deliberately this time, not for the people who had been speaking, but for the people who hadn't. Who else had heard something and chosen to look away? Who else had felt that discomfort and decided it wasn't worth the trouble? He couldn't blame them. That instinct was human, but so was responsibility. Keanu's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in resolve that hadn't fully formed yet. He wasn't thinking about consequences for himself. He was thinking about the person, or people, being talked about so casually, reduced to a problem, an obstacle, a detail to be handled. That kind of language leaves marks long after the words fade. He imagined walking away, the rest of his day continuing as planned. No confrontation, no discomfort. Just another story that never happened. The thought made his chest feel heavier, because he knew how that story would really end. Someone would pay for the silence, and it wouldn't be the people who stayed quiet. That realization locked something into place. Still, he didn't rush. Impulse solves very little. What he needed now wasn't courage, it was judgment. Keanu understood that stepping in the wrong way could make things worse, drawing attention too fast, saying the wrong thing, turning a quiet situation into a defensive one. Power doesn't like being challenged publicly, it adapts. It hides. He needed to be precise. As he stood there, he noticed something else he hadn't before. A shift in the room. Not dramatic, barely noticeable, but real. A few people nearby seemed more alert. Their eyes moved a little more than before. Their posture changed subtly. They had felt it too. That unspoken tension that lingers after something wrong passes through a space. Keanu wasn't alone in sensing it. That mattered, because silence isn't just the absence of sound, it's a collective decision. And decisions can change. He glanced toward the area where the conversation had ended. The people involved were still in the building, moving separately now, acting normal. Normal is the best disguise. Keanu took a slow breath. This was the moment where most people rationalize inaction. It's not clear enough. Someone else will handle it. I could be wrong. He'd used those excuses before. Everyone had. But experience had taught him something uncomfortable. Regret rarely comes from doing too much. It comes from doing nothing when you knew better. He stayed still for a few more seconds, long enough for the discomfort to peak. Then he made a decision. Not about what he would say. Not about who he would confront, but about one simple thing. He wasn't going to ignore this. If you were standing there and heard what he heard, would you step in or convince yourself it wasn't your place? The question didn't just apply to the viewers. It applied to him. Keanu didn't know yet how this would end. He only knew how it would begin. With awareness, with presence, with the refusal to pretend nothing had happened. He straightened slightly, not like someone preparing for a fight, but like someone preparing to speak. Whatever happened next, it wouldn't be accidental. And silence was no longer an option. Keanu remained still, but the lobby had changed, even if most people didn't notice it. The conversation that had passed quietly behind the desk earlier was over, but its echoes lingered in subtle ways. Small gestures, tiny hesitations, almost imperceptible glances, those were the markers of unease that only someone paying attention could catch. Keanu's eyes moved carefully, scanning the room, not with suspicion but with observation. He noticed a hotel staff member adjusting a uniform sleeve nervously. Another guest's hand paused mid-motion as if they'd heard something but weren't supposed to. These weren't dramatic reactions. No one was shouting. No one was panicking. Everything remained polite and quiet. But the energy had shifted, and Keanu felt it immediately. The people involved in the earlier conversation had dispersed. One of them approached the elevators with a purposeful stride, while the other stayed near the concierge desk, occasionally glancing around. They moved as if everything were normal, but their poise had an edge now, a tension that hadn't existed before. Keanu didn't need to see the fear. He could sense it. It radiated subtly, almost like a vibration in the air. Some people can hide their intentions completely. Others, when they know someone has noticed, betray themselves in milliseconds. And that's what he saw now. For the first time, one of the speakers hesitated openly. A word was left hanging mid-sentence. Their hand twitched as though it wanted to gesture but pulled back. They adjusted their posture, a little too rigid, and then tried to force a smile that didn't reach their eyes. Keanu's presence had already affected the situation, even without him saying a word. The room had shifted. People who had been completely unaware of what was happening were now feeling the change, even subconsciously. Near the corner, a hotel guest paused, noticing the slight tension. They glanced around, a brow furrowed, and quickly returned to whatever they were doing. But Keanu could see the recognition in that fleeting glance, a silent acknowledgement that something wasn't right. The person who had appeared most confident before, the one controlling the discussion, was now less composed. Their calm had cracks. Microgestures betrayed unease as a flicker of impatience, a tightening of the jaw, a subtle exhale, as though forcing control back over their environment. Keanu observed quietly, letting the room reveal itself to him. He noticed another detail, a woman walking past, who hadn't been part of the conversation. She paused for a moment, glanced subtly toward the two figures, and then hurried along. Something about the shift in energy had caught her attention. She hadn't heard words, but she felt intent. Human intuition picked up what words could not. And that's the key. Tension doesn't need to be loud. It can exist in glances, gestures, and the quiet awareness that someone else has noticed. Keanu's eyes tracked the controlling figure again. They adjusted their tie, smoothed a sleeve, and looked toward a group of hotel staff nearby. Their posture was tighter now, more deliberate. Someone had noticed, And that awareness, even unspoken, changes behavior in ways that are almost imperceptible, but real. It was subtle, but powerful. The quiet tension in the room now worked in Keanu's favor. No one had panicked. No one had drawn attention. And yet, the people responsible for what he had overheard were no longer entirely comfortable. Their confidence had been chipped away, incrementally, by the awareness that someone else saw what they were doing. Keanu remained calm. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But the room had shifted in ways that only someone paying attention could perceive. Micro-expressions, the slight hesitation in steps, the nervous adjustments, all of it added up. The power balance in that small section of the lobby had already changed. Even the unsuspecting hotel staff were subtly affected. A bellhop who had been wheeling luggage past them slowed his pace just a fraction. Another receptionist glanced over, noticing a faint tension in the air. Not understanding why, but sensing that something had altered the flow of the lobby. Keanu could feel it. He could see it. The air around the two people he had overheard carried a different weight now, less controlled, more human. They were starting to feel the presence of someone who had paid attention, someone who had noticed them. He stayed quiet, still, observant, waiting. The person being manipulated, subtle, almost invisible, was beginning to sense the change too. A flicker of hope, almost imperceptible, passed over them. They hadn't been noticed before, but now someone had seen. And someone caring enough to notice is enough to shift the atmosphere, in a way words often cannot. Keanu's restraint was strategic. The room itself had become a silent participant in the tension. He wasn't creating chaos. He wasn't making a scene. He wasn't forcing action. But the mere act of observing, the act of recognition, had consequences. And that's when he realized sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is nothing, while still being fully present. The tension wasn't physical. It wasn't loud. It was human. It was awareness versus ignorance, courage versus convenience. And for the first time, he felt the energy shift almost tangibly. It wouldn't take much for the next step to occur. Not his step, not yet. But the situation was primed, and Keanu knew it. The room had subtly become a different space than it had been moments ago. Normalcy had been interrupted, not by force, not by confrontation, but by awareness. And in that quiet, almost invisible change, Keanu understood the weight of presence. The observers, both intentional and accidental, were now part of a web that had shifted imperceptibly. And soon, the consequences of what he had overheard would no longer remain quiet. Keanu Reeves stepped forward, but not in a rush. No one noticed. The lobby was still bustling, normal activity continuing as if nothing had happened. The piano played, the bell chimed, suitcases rolled across the marble floors. Guests chatted softly, staff moved efficiently, life uninterrupted. Yet in the small space near the concierge desk, everything had changed. The subtle tension Keanu had noticed earlier had grown. The people he had overheard were no longer entirely confident. Micro-gestures betrayed their unease. Pauses lingered longer, smiles were forced, eyes darted, and someone, a silent bystander caught in their dynamic, had begun to shift subtly. Sensing a potential ally, Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He walked calmly toward the group, measured steps, eyes observing, body language unassuming but deliberate. His movement alone carried authority, not the flashy authority of a celebrity, but the quiet authority of someone fully aware, fully present and entirely focused on what needed to be done. When he arrived close enough, he stopped. Still neutral, still composed. The controlling figure, the one who had seemed untouchable, noticed him at last. A flicker of recognition crossed their face, but it wasn't fear. It was calculation. They weren't used to being watched by someone who hadn't been warned, someone who didn't react immediately. Keanu didn't say a word for a moment. He simply observed. That observation alone was enough to communicate the shift in power. The quiet presence of attention, awareness, accountability. And then, when the moment was right, he spoke. "Let go," he said, his voice calm, measured, unshakable. Now, it wasn't a command shouted, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't performative, it was precise, authoritative, and unmistakable. The effect was immediate. The controlling figure's eyes widened subtly, a micro-expression Keanu had learned to read over decades. Their hand loosened, their posture softened. They hadn't expected someone to intervene in such a quiet but deliberate way. The bystander, the person who had been silently constrained earlier, shifted as well. Relief flickered across their features. No words were exchanged between them and Keanu, but the acknowledgement was there. The silent communication that someone had noticed, someone cared, someone had acted responsibly. Keanu's calmness was the signal, the authority, the intervention. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't draw attention to himself. He didn't make anyone else in the lobby pause or panic. Yet everything had changed. The tension that had been building, the silent, almost invisible weight in the air, began to lift. The controlling figure retreated slightly, adjusting their posture. Their dominance subtly diminished. It wasn't humiliation or anger. It was recognition that their previous behavior was no longer unchecked. Keanu watched carefully, assessing, not for revenge, not for satisfaction, but to make sure the balance had truly shifted, that the person who had been at risk now had room to breathe, to act, to exist without the constant shadow of coercion. Around him, life continued. Guests were still moving, staff still working, and yet the small, quiet world that had held tension was settling differently. Awareness had done what confrontation often can't. Presence had done what power often fails to accomplish. "Are you all right?" Keanu asked softly to the bystander. No theatrics, just a simple question, human, direct, and grounding. They nodded, a subtle but complete confirmation. No words needed beyond that. The situation was stabilized. Nothing flashy, nothing excessive, nothing that could be criticized later as overreach. Just presence, attention, and action at exactly the right moment. Keanu took a final moment to ensure everyone involved understood, at least subconsciously, that the power dynamics had shifted. The controlling individual now knew their actions had consequences. The bystander now knew they were not alone, and Keanu himself had acted responsibly, quietly, without spectacle. And then, without fanfare, he stepped back. The lobby returned to normal. The piano played. Guests laughed softly, staff moved efficiently. No one knew exactly what had changed, except the people who had needed it most. Keanu's intervention hadn't been about heroics. It hadn't been about fame or recognition. It had been about one simple principle: noticing when silence is dangerous and acting with calm, deliberate authority. The effect lingered. Not visible to everyone, not dramatic but undeniable. Those who had been controlling now acted more cautiously. The bystander breathed a little easier, and the room itself had subtly shifted in atmosphere. Keanu walked away slowly, seamlessly blending back into the normal rhythm of the hotel lobby. No applause, no acknowledgement. Nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of having done what was right. Because sometimes, the most powerful action is the one that requires the least attention. The lesson was simple, but effective. Courage is quiet. Authority is subtle. Awareness changes outcomes. And in that quiet moment, everyone involved knew something had happened. They just didn't need to say it out loud. The lobby settled into its usual rhythm. Guests continued to move about, checking in and out, laughing softly, unaware that anything unusual had occurred. The piano melody filled the air, blending with the soft hum of conversation and the rolling of luggage. Yet the space that had been heavy with tension now carried a subtle difference. The air felt lighter, almost imperceptibly so, but it was there. The bystander, the person who had been silently constrained, whose quiet fear had gone unnoticed before, moved with a slightly straighter posture. Their shoulders were no longer weighted with anticipation or dread. Keanu observed from a distance, his presence no longer required but still alert. He didn't linger for recognition. He didn't seek gratitude. His role had been simple: notice, assess, and act in a quiet, deliberate way that changed the outcome. The controlling figure, previously so confident, now carried a subtle restraint in their movements. Their eyes no longer darted as freely. The small cracks in their composure reminded them that actions, even those hidden in plain sight, have consequences when someone attentive is watching. Keanu's calm authority had shifted the balance. Not through violence, not through confrontation, not through spectacle, but through presence. Awareness had been enough. Responsibility had been enough. And that was sometimes more powerful than words or force could ever be. He finally moved toward the exit, blending back into the background, like he had never been there. But the change he created lingered. The room itself had adjusted to the intervention. Even those who had not directly participated had sensed it, if only subconsciously. The bystander, now subtly empowered, recognized that someone had noticed, someone had cared, someone had acted quietly but decisively. That acknowledgement, though unspoken, carried weight. It was a reminder that even small acts of attention and intervention can create significant impact. As Keanu walked past the lobby's entrance, he reflected briefly on what had just happened. Not the details of the overheard conversation, not the shifts in posture or tension, but the principle behind it all. Silence may be safe, convenient, and easy, but it often allows harm to continue unchecked. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't require heroics. It doesn't require recognition. It doesn't require grand gestures. It requires awareness, presence, and deliberate action at exactly the right moment. That is enough. Keanu didn't need applause. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need anyone to understand exactly what he had done. The satisfaction came from knowing that the right action had been taken when it mattered most. That someone who might have suffered silently now had the space to breathe, to move, and to exist without fear. And that was the real power, not fame, not attention, not dramatic confrontation, but quiet, deliberate intervention. He paused for a moment near the exit doors, glancing back once at the lobby. Everything appeared normal. Guests chatted. Staff moved efficiently. The piano played. The world continued, unchanged on the surface. Yet beneath it, everything was different. A subtle shift, almost invisible to anyone not paying attention, but real. That subtle shift was enough. Enough to prevent harm. Enough to create hope. Enough to demonstrate the impact of one person acting responsibly, quietly, deliberately. Keanu stepped outside into the light of day, the world continuing as it had before. But he carried with him the knowledge that intervention doesn't need spectacle to succeed. Awareness, courage, and deliberate action are often more effective than any dramatic display. The moment reinforced a lesson that anyone can carry with them. Courage is not always loud. Power is not always forceful. Awareness, presence, and the decision to act when you see something wrong, these are the things that can truly change outcomes. Doing the right thing doesn't always require recognition or applause. It requires noticing what others overlook, valuing the safety and dignity of those affected, and stepping in quietly, but effectively when it matters most. Even small, deliberate interventions can ripple outward, creating shifts that are almost imperceptible yet profoundly meaningful. Sometimes the world changes not because someone shouts, but because someone simply notices and acts. If this story made you think about the power of presence and noticing the small signs around you, share it in the comments. Have you ever seen something wrong and taken action, or wished you had? Tell us where you were and what happened. Even in quiet moments, awareness matters. And sometimes the smallest action can prevent the biggest harm.